Welcome to Coding Your Career. I'm Jonathan Hopp, and today I'm joined by Nate Eagle. How you doing, Nate?
I'm doing great. How are you doing,
I,
John?
I am doing fantastic. It's super awesome to get to talk to you. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
So, my name is Nate Eagle. I have been working in the software engineering industry roughly for about, I don't know, since 2005, something like that.
Wow.
So, over 15 years. I am the proud graduate of sort of an unusual college, St. John's College, where we studied the great books for 4 years. And I also love to play tennis and Go in my free time. And the latter is how I know you.
Yeah, Go is a great game. So it sounds like you didn't start off with a technical degree then. So it sounds more like this was literature.
Yeah, literature is a way to think about it. So when I was in high school, my favorite things in the world were reading books and being in plays. And didn't really know where I wanted to go to school. I had an okay GPA and I had good SAT scores. So I went to a professor or went to a teacher and was like, help me make this decision. And he ended up telling me about this college he had gone to called St. John's. There are just two campuses in Annapolis and Santa Fe. And it's unusual in that it has no majors, and everybody who goes there is just expected to study take a 4 year curriculum that has math, science, language, literature, philosophy, like the music, all of the stuff that used to be considered part of fundamental education.
Right.
And it's a tremendous education. Part of the idea is that it combats like over specialization, like you actually get this broad base. But of course, the downside is when you graduate, there's no, oh, hey, come into the liberal arts industry. You got to figure out the next step on your own.
That sounds surprisingly familiar to my experience with my Asian Studies degree, which was more specialized. But I think the end point was, okay, great, you've got it. Now you need to figure out what you're going to do with it.
Exactly.
So how did you end up developing then?
Yeah. So when I was in high school, I got into making web pages on my own kind of early. I was pretty online in the 90s when it wasn't quite so common to be online. I liked to play a lot of muds and mushes and things like that.
Can I tell you just right now how this sounds exactly like my origin story here? Probably like superhero origin stories. I played MUDs in high school. I was online in the 90s when other people necessarily weren't. I did websites for churches. Did you do websites for churches?
I was raised in churches. My dad was an evangelical pastor, and yeah, they're often looking for the simplest, cheapest website possible. I don't think I ever did. I don't think I ever did. But I did websites for things like that. But mostly I was doing websites for my own edification. And so, like, when I went to college in 1999, I made a website just for myself that could be listed in the students section. And there were like 12 students in the whole college that had made their own web pages. And anybody who was there, we got constant emails from like perspectives because it was the most interesting way to try to find out what college was actually. There wasn't a lot of filter back then. And so I actually, the way I got into the industry really, yeah, this is my true origin moment, was I had a job in the dish pit doing dishes for work study wages, which is a pretty good wage. I was earning like $8 an hour to wash dishes. It was overpaid. But then I was also not successfully getting up early enough for my shifts. And so I kept just like missing them. And so I wasn't earning any money. A friend who knew I had made a web page for like for just myself came and ran to me one day and was like, "Hey, the webmaster for the college just quit and left the school. You should go and tell him you can make web pages and see if you can get that gig." And so I did. And so I ran in it. They hired me on the strength of being able to like modify web pages. And I continued to earn $8 an hour, but now I was doing something that was actually fun and was not first thing in the morning. And so there that was the first time I ever saw like CSS being used in web pages. And the first time I ever saw PHP code. Because all I knew was how to like wrap text in tags and stuff like that and do table-based layouts. Yeah.
I miss table-based layouts so much. They had soul back in the day.
There is something, I think anybody who is old enough to remember them has, there's a way in which designing with them was relatively easy because you could take a clearer path from what you were mocking up in Photoshop or whatever free image editor you downloaded, either legally or not, into then what you made with tables. And they stretched to some degree in predictable ways. And really, especially for the first era of CSS behavior was always much less predictable until you reached a certain threshold of expertise. And so tons of people had well, and continue to have tremendously frustrating experiences with CSS layouts, especially at the start.
Yeah, it was interesting back in the day because again, I didn't have an editor where I just used Notepad. So I would
Totally.
make web pages using tables and I would have to visualize the nested tables and then I never got into the whole SEO or titles or anything like that. But I just felt back in the day you really you had more freedom. Like there's less rules. You just okay, cool, this is what might look good. We'll just put it together and see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think using Notepad was back then really the first sign of having an insight into how to get better at making web pages. Because in general, the tools that tried to make things easy mostly got in your way. And if they didn't, and they would start to break in unpredictable ways. And once they broke, it was very hard to figure out what in the heck they were doing wrong. And so at least with Notepad, you could break it down into code that you really understood. And then you could then, when stuff didn't work, you could see what mattered, what was there, and modify
Yeah.
it.
So let's talk about this transition. And so you're like webmaster now, right? Like webmaster used to be a very mysterious title back in the day. So you're a webmaster, and then how'd you go from webmaster to like take me on this journey?
Yeah, so I was there like really happy to have a good work study job. I was making new designs for the college's webpage that then I would alter the homepage that literally everyone saw. It's crazy because it was like the last part of that era when some rando student would ever be entrusted with something like that.
Right.
By like 2003, they had figured out how important college websites were, and they hired a company to do it for hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I was like the last. I was using this several CDs we had of professional photographs of the college that had been taken, and just like making stuff. But I didn't exactly think that I wanted to make that my career. I mostly wanted to be like an English teacher. I met a lovely young woman who I got married to right after we graduated, and we wanted to do the Peace Corps together. While we were waiting to get into the Peace Corps, because it's a long application process for anybody that's ever thinking about doing that, it can take a year or more to get
Oh
placed.
yeah.
While we were waiting to do that, I got a job working with at-risk teenagers in Charlottesville, where we were living, and then being a part-time English teacher at a private high school. But of course, what I found was that I just kept making web pages on the side, just because that was the thing that I really loved doing. I installed my first content management system, which was movable type, like a thing for making blogs from back in the day. And so then, even when we went into the Peace Corps, there were cyber cafes all around, and that's where everyone wanted to go and spend their hard-earned money to get to use the internet. And I found that like a bunch of the people we were working with, like the little tiny NGOs, one of the biggest things they wanted was a web page somewhere, just like a URL that they could point to that would give them some sort of organizational legitimacy. And so I was way better and way more interested in making those web pages for NGOs than I was at agroforestry. And so when I came back from the Peace Corps, I had this determination. I was like, I want to somehow get into tech. And my wife said, yeah, that's the only thing making web pages is the only thing I've never seen you procrastinate. Like you're really into that. And so when we came back, I basically started getting on Craigslist and was determined to find an entry level gig somewhere in something related to the web.
Wait a second. Did you just say Craigslist? You just went on Craigslist.
Oh yeah. Craigslist was how my wife and I both found our first jobs coming back from the Peace Corps. She became a Trader Joe's manager, which she is to this day. I started looking for jobs in Seattle, which is where I'd grown up in Washington State, not in Seattle, but nearby. And then I started looking for jobs in Washington, D.C., where we had a bunch of friends from St. John's. And there were the ones in Washington, D.C., where I found leads.
Wow. Okay, that is different. I didn't think you'd find a job like through that Craigslist, but again, like I always tell people, like the 2000s were a different time.
They
Really.
really were. They really were.
So, what was your first job then, as
So
a developer?
my first job as a developer was working for this web agency in Alexandria, Virginia called Matrix Group as a webmaster. That was my title. And really, the majority of the job was two things. It was making changes to HTML pages or like cold fusion pages for
Oh, I love Cold Fusion.
clients. Yeah. And pushing those live and billing in 15-minute increments, just like updating text, updating lists, updating images, all sorts of stuff like that. And then it was also doing what we called at the time like slicing designs, getting redesigns for clients as comps, we called them. And they're called mocks a lot of places, just straight from Photoshop, and slicing those into layouts. And the core skill that probably got me that job was that I knew how to do CSS layouts. I had been reading this A List Apart, which was this really important website at the time that was really advocating for standards, for web standards, and for more modern based ways of making web pages. So there's also the site called Zen Garden. It was at the forefront at the time of trying to evangelize the flexibility that you got by doing these, by using CSS rather than using tables. And so I did know how to do that, even though I really had not too many other professional skills. I certainly didn't know how to code. I only knew about markup, CSS, and like working with designs and stuff like that.
Okay, so you really started off more with more of the UI UX sort of domain as it was back in the day. By the way,
Yeah.
Zen Garden, I love that call out. I remember Zen Garden because I
Nice.
also remember the transition from tables and the Wild West of here's how we're going to display things to something more like learning from this entire menagerie of people doing stuff randomly. Here's what we picked out were things that probably make a lot of sense or best practices, and like extracting those and evangelizing them. So I do remember that part because I was like, oh yeah, this makes a whole lot more sense than what I was doing.
Yeah, totally.
So then you would say then that your beginning was less about the back end, less about servers and stuff like that, and more about like how do I present a display and design that the user can pick up and immediately understand and start using.
Yeah, that's completely accurate. I had no knowledge of coding. I think I would have called HTML coding at that time, but of course it's not. It's really about ways of, you know, turning a document into layers of semantic markup and then visual presentation. The other thing was that I was a big digital photography hobbyist, and so I'd learned a bunch about using Photoshop. And at the time, especially, being able to really be intelligent and careful with your slicing up a Photoshop document and being able to use that well was a big part of that. And yeah, it felt like a limitation to me at the time. I always was so frustrated that I didn't understand what was going on with the back end stuff at all. Couldn't really affect that part of things. But there was a lot of work to be done for people that really could handle that design. I mean, not the design side, but like the layer of interface creation. And one of the big things that helped me be successful, especially that first year, was that I was a great problem solver. And there were these really tricky issues, especially getting things to work across browser back then. Like getting
Oh,
your,
wow. Yeah, that was a huge issue.
yeah. So like making yours like IE6 or IE5 compatible. And there were all these tricks for hacking styles only to one particular browser. And then so my favorite thing was when other developers had problems they couldn't solve. And I would say, okay, I, I'm going to come in and I'm going to get to be a hero here because I loved to get to play that role, and I would just not let it beat me. I would come up with a way, and that was just a really exciting part of that job at that time.
I love the fact that you and I both came of age in the internet at this about the same time because I know exactly what you're talking about. Let's paint a picture for people a little bit because in the modern age, I don't think people quite appreciate how Wild West browsers were back then. Like right now, I go on to Sauce Labs and I take my UI and I run it through my automated test and it goes through all the different Internet Explorer and Firefox and Google. Back in the day, the big companies were still figuring out what their browser should even do, right? What they should come with. There weren't any real standards. So, like, your website could have this gorgeous, beautiful, intuitive, lovely design in IE6 or whatever it happened to be, right? But then
Mhm.
you would move context and then it would just completely be different.
Yeah, I mean, IE was the big sort of notorious player in that space because there were web standards back then, but there wasn't agreement about how to implement everything, and especially with Microsoft, there wasn't even agreement that like following those standards was something that they cared about doing. And so IE like 3 I think was maybe the first browser to implement CSS. Like IE was the first browser to implement the XML HTTP request that made Ajax possible. Like it did a bunch of cool stuff, but it just didn't necessarily care. Like it wanted to be the front page to the internet or the only thing that mattered in a lot of ways, which is how it's related to how they got into the whole trouble with the antitrust. Yeah, exactly. But I remember when like Microsoft's official position at one time was that IE6 was going to be the last version of the browser, and it was just going to be there forever. They weren't going to release any subsequent versions because they didn't need to. And so there was this era where we were so limited by what it could do. And no matter what other browsers did or how they innovated, you still had to come market for make your websites play well with this recalcitrant child that still, dominated the market in terms of the number of people who had it. It was crazy. It was just legitimately hard. It would just be a major part of your professional qualification that you could handle that reality in making web pages work.
I do appreciate you pointing out the fact that how ubiquitous IE was, because again, at the time, that was when like personal computers were starting to become a normal everyday household thing. I do remember when that wasn't the case, where people didn't have cell phones and they didn't have personal computers at home. I'm saying where people would memorize other people's phone numbers in a quainter, simpler time. And then Windows came, and then IE came, and by default, it was the one most people use, right? There were other browsers if you were in the know, but IE was it because you click the button and there it is. So
Yeah.
you had to you had to basically play their ball game. What I'm interested in learning now is okay, so you're a webmaster, you're using your Photoshop skills, your photography skills, your like eye for design, which by the way I highly admire anyone who has that. How did you grow from there?
Yeah, it was something I was very much trying to figure out. And I was ambitious and restless. I liked what I was doing to some degree, but I saw the designs we were making and was, I could do better than this. We're not making stuff that looks that great. And I was seeing the full on developers doing Cold Fusion in the background. And I was seeing some of the first websites that really used JavaScript in a really impressive way. I remember there was this agency, or it's still an agency in our area called Viget, Viget, that just was one of the first sites that had all of these JavaScript driven animations and interactions on their site. And I was just amazed. And I really wanted to be part of that. And so I was just trying to figure my way into the coolest stuff happening on the internet that I saw, because I had this job and I was very happy for it, but it was not making websites that were on the coolest parts of the internet. But it was pretty challenging, because I think it's hard for people to imagine just how different the landscape was in terms of like resources for self-education. Like
Facts.
one thing I ended up doing was taking like a JavaScript class at the local community college that I got my employer to pay for, which is very inexpensive. And so that gave me some introduction into like legitimate coding, learning some of the concepts like looping and interacting with the DOM. And I remember we used Alice, which was an earlier programming language devoted purely to teaching, to learn some of those concepts. But it was rough going. I've seen other people who, when they start to teach themselves coding, this is my perception of you, to be honest, who just seem to get it so naturally and fall into it. A lot of that's probably an illusion, but
Just a little bit.
but for me, it was really tough. And so I did, at the same time that I was really trying to learn coding, I was also trying to prove myself as a designer. And I got my company to let me start making my own comps as part of redesign like challenges. Basically, their system was that when companies would ask for a redesign, they would get 3 designers to make first round designs for them. And they would be, as much as possible, like different directions that could go. And then the company would pick one of the designs, then that designer would work with them for the rest of the time to implement their design. And so without having any change in my job position, I got a couple of my designs picked. And so then after a little while, I got promoted to a design position. So then I ended up, my second job was working for PBS Kids as a designer, which was pretty amazing in a lot of ways. Certainly my parents were probably happier to say where I worked during that period than they've ever been before or since. And while I was working at PBS Kids, that's when jQuery happened. And jQuery is just one of the coolest things that happened in the world of the front end, really in the 21st century, I'd say.
That's quite the moniker.
I'm utterly serious about that. I'm 100% serious. And I'll tell you why. First of all, the reason most relevant to me is that it created this on-ramp into JavaScript for people who were primarily CSS experts.
I could see that. I could see that.
Because one of the core parts of jQuery was what came to be known as the sizzle selector engine. So you would use the $ open parens, and then you would just pass in the CSS selector. and it would do all the DOM querying to find that selector. And you targeted stuff exactly the same way you did in CSS. And for anybody who thinks that's a little weird, it's super trivial to do that. You can just use query selector or query selector all. Those methods didn't exist, and the only reason they exist now is because of jQuery and because they basically copied the jQuery as much as possible in adding new features to the DOM. And so now the DOM works great. It's a pleasure to deal with because it's just native jQuery.
You know what? I'll be honest with you. I did not know that. I did not know that those were not part of the original package. That I actually okay. Now I truly get the revolutionary quality of jQuery because yeah, you're right. If you're used to CSS, if that's like where you live 99% of your day, then you just add these extra little symbols, and then there you go. Now you're doing JavaScript.
Yeah, and it felt like CS in a lot of ways. Like you'd grab your elements, you target it, and then you just attach some behavior instead of a look. And so the flow was very similar. And so at the time, then the next question became, is it bad that people are learning how to use jQuery but don't really know how to use JavaScript? Because there were competing frameworks like MooTools or like Prototype that had less of a cutesy approach to things that were a little bit more like just making jQuery more powerful and pleasant to deal with, and were oftentimes more popular with people who knew a lot about coding. Whereas jQuery, it had some advocates who were very good at coding, but it had a lot of people like me who that was the first step into dynamic behavior we'd learned.
So then, would you say then that was a good gateway into doing more just, I don't want to call it JavaScript programming, because with jQuery, you're still attaching it like events and things like that to DOM objects, but there's still code in there, right? There's still control statements and things like that. It allows you to attach the two together. Would you say that's like your first step into more what most people would consider a traditional programmer?
Absolutely. And actually, it's because I got more and more into jQuery while I was working at PBS Kids, and just started realizing how easy it was to start adding a lot of animation, especially to
Yeah.
web pages I was working with. That then I got to be strong enough at the kind of JavaScript that then I was able to get a job. Even when I started working at AOL in 2009 or 10, I can't remember, it already was pretty passe. And everybody knew AOL, and everybody was a little surprised that it still existed. Um, but to be honest, I ended up working there for 5 years all told, and it was a great place to work in a ton of ways. I consciously left design because, for one thing, I didn't love having to have the kind of conversations you do as a designer where you really have to convince people about your approach and your ideas. And you have to deal with a lot of, oh, let's make this thing pop more. Or I just want the design to be cleaner. And there's so much interaction, whereas coding was way more, if you could get it working, people trusted what you were doing to some degree. And I just enjoyed, I don't know, I enjoyed being my editor. And there's something a little bit like literature and like poetry about code, where it's so much about language and clarity of idea and intent and path, right? And it was just, to be honest, it was a pleasure. And so, yeah, I guess I just kept wanting to do more with it when I was at AOL. And so even though we were a jQuery shop, that was really when I started watching all of these Douglas Crockford videos from YUI Theater at the time. They were all about JavaScript just at its core. And I loved those. And that's really where I started to see myself as a fundamental like JavaScript developer rather than like a jQuery developer.
Okay, so that was your first foray into like that. Your identity then became I am a JavaScript developer rather than just like a designer or things like that. So then, did you move? Did you still stay in the front end more, or did you start moving towards the back end? Because I think the early 2000s was when like Node.js came out, right? So where people were saying, okay, we got
Mm.
JavaScript. It was this language that was originally for to make the browser interactive, but hey, what if we could build a server in JavaScript? What if we could build X, Y, and Z in JavaScript? Because I remember like late 2000s, early 2010s, people started taking JavaScript and maybe like expanding it into areas it wasn't originally designed for.
Yeah, a whole lot of that was happening all at the same time and in different ways. For one thing, JavaScript was getting a lot faster right then. Like there was a lot of innovation coming, especially from V8 in terms of JavaScript execution speed. And so one of the big things when I started at AOL was like jQuery and JavaScript performance. And you really had to learn a lot about how to cache your selectors properly, how to do things in smart ways, because interacting with the DOM was quite expensive, quite
Yeah.
slow. And then doing all sorts of things was pretty slow. And so you really had to be smart. But then there started to be really rapid developments, like I said, especially with Chrome, that were making jQuery, or that was making just JavaScript faster across the board. And the DOM itself, the standard started to improve. They started to take all these cues from JavaScript. And then, like you said, Node got implemented at that time, which was not the first, but was really the first sort of big, flashy implementation of JavaScript on the back end. And so I guess I will, like a bunch of things are happening at once. And one of the things that did happen that I want to call out, especially in terms of what our core themes are, is that I ended up working for a while. I can't remember exactly how long, but maybe the better part of a year with a college classmate of mine to just do mentoring about JavaScript.
Hmm.
And that was really the time when I think I crossed over the most from someone who was piecing together snippets of things I could find online and like getting things to work, to understanding core language concepts enough to really work with it on my own. And it really, yeah, it didn't happen until I was able to have that direct back and forth one-on-one and say, wait, what's going on with what functions return? I
Right.
understand, here's a thing, do the thing in the code, and learning about like context. Like this is such a challenge when you're first starting to learn JavaScript. And
This is a concept that's very difficult to teach in any language that uses this. To be honest with you, just my
well,
own personal experience.
I think Douglas Crockford said in his series that it was just an unfortunate name because it's hard to even say it. Like,
Right.
oh, this is what this is. Yeah.
You're saying that you look a little bit slightly embarrassed because you're just forced to make the sentence that way, but he's correct in that. Okay,
Right.
so then we have the sort of explosion of JavaScript. What do you? I actually would love to hear your opinion about this because I don't do as much front end development. Like I do React and like Angular and all these other things. And I can follow comps. People give me comps. Hey, Jonathan, make it look like this. Okay, great. I can make it look the way you want me to make it look. Don't ask me about what you think my opinion of it is because I want to go back to my math and algorithms. But from your perspective, what do you think of like this explosion of JavaScript front end frameworks? Like we have, it's not just like React and Angular are huge, right? But we have Ember, we have Meteor, we have all these other ones whose names I have forgotten because the new one comes out every week. What do you like? How do you feel about that explosion of like front end JavaScript frameworks?
Yeah, that was happening right during this era too, in the early teens. Yeah, the first one I ever interacted with was Backbone JS. But
Oh, that's
then
old school. I love it.
But then, yeah, then there was Ember and there was Angular and React in terms of some of the big early players. And Ember had the reputation of being really beloved by pretty serious coders but being intimidating. Whereas Angular, it had the reputation, it got its start as a language for designers to use for prototyping. Google, they wanted this tool to make it easier for designers to create interactive prototypes that would show how things work. And so the idea of these tag-based behavioral controls that Angular had was really, what if HTML just had like a way to specify dynamic behavior that worked similarly to the way all the other things about it worked? And then React was very different, and its initial pitch, at least the way I remember it, was speed, because using the virtual DOM to diff against, to render a component, see what things change in its own internal virtual thing, and then only touch the parts of the DOM that actually that needed to be updated there, was a big sort of speed advantage, especially compared to the initial version of Angular.
Yep.
Yeah, it was super exciting as the short take on it, because it started to allow for all of this very advanced like dynamic behavior. And on the one hand, it was a little sad because it was like this utterly other way of working than the very 100% DOM focused methods using jQuery that a lot of us were using all of the time. It was this abstraction from that. But on the other hand, it was just so powerful. And it created like essentially this new space. There was all of a sudden this application layer there in the front end. It was a little bit like, working in the back end, but very different. It was hard figuring out what to choose, because it felt, especially to me as like a relatively greener developer, felt like a lot to learn to commit to any one of those. But that's when I made my first app, and I was learning Node for the first time, but I picked Angular, Node, Express, and MongoDB. And that's when I made Go Kibitz, this app I have that still has a startling amount of users today. Yeah. But that was my jump into that world. And it was to be able to make a whole app with a skill that had started out just making things animate a little bit on my web pages. It felt like the world had handed me a superpower.
That's actually really wonderful. I think people don't realize just how much React and Angular and just like frameworks like them, like you said, it's like an application layer, right? We're adding like another
Mm-hmm.
layer onto what we were doing previously. And again, we are abstracting stuff. By doing that, we're also gaining a lot of power that way. And I
Yeah.
think that's actually a really good call out. One question I do have recently, let's just say the past few years, where have you seen your career go? Because it sounds like from the trajectory you're telling me, it's you're like me when we were teenagers. We had fun on the computer. We learned different things. We put stuff together. Eventually, you formalize the knowledge and just, okay, I need to learn JavaScript. I
Mm-hmm.
need to learn programming concepts. Once you got more mature in your career, what were you focusing on then?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the points that I feel like is big from my current perspective is that the path isn't always clear, and people are not necessarily going to do it for you. Or if they do, they might not. It might be a little bit more about just what they and the world need than what you really want to do. And for me, there was a real acceleration once I got my first job as a developer rather than as a designer, in terms of just how easy it was to get another job when or if I needed it. I would just start saying yes to the recruiters who always filled up my inbox instead of no. But it was like, it meant that for a certain amount of time, I was like floating down a river on a raft like Huck and Jim,
Mhm.
not steering myself too much, but going where the river went. And I would find at times that there was a real difference between what I was learning just on the job as part of getting good at what my workplace needed to do, and what I needed to learn to do the work that I was most excited about. AOL was probably a good example of that, where we were getting paid good money and treated really well, but to work on a lot of kind of very internal, somewhat strange products that weren't necessarily the way other people were doing anything. And it was a very common worry that I had, as well as other people, but that we would not have skills that were translatable to other jobs. And so if we got laid off, which wasn't uncommon at AOL, they were always trying to change directions, and so they would get rid of one division or another. But or if we just wanted to find something else, that we might not have a skill that's relevant anywhere else. And so you have to say, do I face taking a pretty significant pay cut so that I can get maybe a more junior level position and learn stuff from the ground up? And so I guess what I found is that I've had to manage, and I've done it better sometimes than others, essentially continually having side hustles, or like an extracurricular interest in trying to steer my technology interests in the way that is going to satisfy me the most. And so making apps on my own has been one of the best things for that, because making Go Kibitz was how I got a job doing React app development after AOL. Because regardless of all the stuff that I couldn't even show that much at AOL, I could show this is an app I made using a modern tech stack entirely on my own. I think this proves I can adapt to the way you're doing things. And that's just been a requirement. And I think there's a dark side to that. Not every job forces you to have a side job to keep yourself afloat, to keep yourself relevant. But this job, I think for most people, it does.
This is a tightrope walk because I always, for example, when I first started teaching boot camps, some of we get surveys, and there's one of the students were like, "Why are we learning jQuery? Why are we learning vanilla JavaScript? Why don't we just skip to React? Why don't we just skip to the
Mhm.
React and the GraphQL? Because who's going to need these things?" I tell them a lot of people are going to need these things because a lot of people don't use React. Like there are companies who are still doing vanilla JavaScript or doing jQuery, and they're not only are they not using React, they're not interested in upgrading to React. So there's that side of the argument where part of the market is going to be like 10 years from now, right? Maybe they're just going to be using React version 19 and they're not interested in going to version 40 or whatever it will be by then. There's still people using Visual Basic. There's still people using, I'm sure there's someone out there using Cold Fusion. On the other hand, the cutting edge, right? If your goal may be more salary based, or your goal may be doing more cutting edge technologies or getting in with new companies, then they're more interested in the latest version of React, the latest version of Angular. They're interested in, do you do functional programming? So how
Mhm.
did you walk that tightrope?
Yeah, I will say, first of all, I think a lot of times being most cutting edge is not at all the same goal as maximizing your salary. A lot of the people earning some of the best salaries are actually the people in maybe the more conservative side of where things are, because lots of companies have big, important applications that are doing real work, that are using older stacks that have been around for a while, because software justifies itself or creates value more and more the longer the same code is being used, right?
It's
You
true.
know,
That's
all
100%
the
true.
costs are up front in making new stuff. And then the longer that it just keeps doing something useful without having to remake it and stuff like that, the more valuable it is. So I will say, I don't want to lose track of your core question, but while you're talking, it made me really want to emphasize the idea of evergreen skills versus like less evergreen skills.
Okay.
Um,
Can you tell
like,
us what evergreen, what that means?
yeah, I guess when I use the term, what I mean is like how long a skill will be relevant. And so if you learned, if for instance, if you put all of your chips on Ember, in 2011 or whatever, a whole bunch of that became pretty irrelevant in not too long a time, because React, especially Angular to a lesser degree, came out as the big winners in that period. And there just weren't that many jobs attached to it. If, on the other hand, you spent a bunch of your time really working on your core vanilla JavaScript skills, then everything you learned there is basically 100% relevant today in any framework that you use. In general, most of the major frameworks have steered more toward letting you write natural JavaScript and not trying to give you alternate interfaces to that, but letting you use that. That's actually one of the reasons that React has been fairly popular, was that a lot of people argued that it was more like writing natural JavaScript with some nice bonus features added than it was like learning someone else's separate world. The other big example is Linux mastery. Like when you learn about how to do stuff in Windows or OS 10, or like all sorts of other things, those are things that change rapidly over time. If you learn to be like a real master of the shell, that skill is going to be relevant basically forever.
That's what it is. At the end of the day, that's what it is you are working with, is the shell, right? At the end of the day with React, what you're working with is React is still doing DOM manipulation at the end of the day.
Yeah. And similarly, like when I was doing design, some of the time I was like trying to learn Flash and ActionScript. And then some of the time I was reading like Micah or I can't remember what it stands for. This like Art Institute's book on like the history of graphic design principles, and checking out just like all these books on the list of like design classics and learning about fundamental usability principles like affordance and stuff like that. And those skills are deeply evergreen. They're the same thing. Like they just don't change that much with the changing of the web. And so I think it makes sense for people, and certainly it's been a big thing for me, because everyone has limited time, everyone has limited energy. And if you are in an industry like ours with a lot of churn, like you really need to make conscious decisions about focusing more on evergreen skills than on less evergreen skills. And it's not always going to be, it's often not going to be the same stuff that's the most talked about online, the most on Twitter and things like that.
I feel like with prompt engineering, that's very much like the latest thing, hot topic du jour that everyone kind of runs towards, and then they find out later it actually isn't really a core skill. It's identifying those core skills, what it sounds like to me, that last you, like they stand the test of time, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to bring in terms of the current moment we're in. Using ChatGPT to like pair program is changing my life tremendously. It still
Yeah.
really works best as an amplifier rather than a substitute. First of all, learning how to work well with ChatGPT is just not that it's not that hard for anybody else to learn too. Everybody, a whole lot of people are going to all have those same
This
skills.
is forbidden information, Nate. We can't let this out to the public. That it's actually pretty easy to use.
But what can really matter is like where you where you have real mastery and can work and can have it work with you in powerful ways. I was trying to make a tool a little while ago that would do something really stupidly simple. I was tired of having to like bring my laptop into our meeting rooms, pull up my calendar, find the calendar link, get the Zoom number, and then plug that into the stupid little controller for our like meeting room audio visual equipment. Really annoyed me. And so what I wanted was a shell script that would check my calendar for me, grab the whatever is the nearest meeting that's about to happen or is already underway, parse it, find the meeting code, and then say it out loud using the say command in my prompt. And so there's some non-trivial parsing and stuff that needed to go on there, and some figuring out of the like an API to work with the calendar. And so we were in early days of ChatGPT, and I got it, and so I had it help me come up with something. And at first, I really wanted it to be a shell script so that it would be maximally portable. But I found that it started to get really bogged down in the details of regular expressions. And we would try to work through the different bugs, me pointing out what was going wrong, stuff like that. But finally, I said, you know what? Let's switch tacks. I know JavaScript really well. Let's just translate the whole thing to JavaScript, and then I will fix the regular expression issue. And of course, one of the things it can do tremendously is do that kind of translation, put it into JavaScript, and then immediately I was able to see what was going wrong, fix it myself, and boom, we had something. But really, we finally solved the problem, and we solved it well when we paired a deep practical knowledge on my part. I have tons of experience doing regular expressions in JavaScript. I love it. With ChatGPT's ability to be more sort of a generalist, to know about these different tools to pull in to give us a good start.
That's amazing. So I think that this idea of pair programming with ChatGPT is a good segue, because I recently did a project where it helps me with DevOps, which is like personally my weakest area. I have a hard time understanding, again, like AWS is this like multi-fang clawed monster to me with all of these like IDs and permissions, and I do not like, it's very hard for me to engage with it. And I like to ask a ton of questions. And so ChatGPT doesn't get annoyed with your questions, and it can go into any amount of detail you feel like. I like to ask it really dumb questions. What if I were to do this? Would it break the whole thing? No, actually, you can just select these things, put that thing here. It will take care of it. And I was able to get a basic API in AWS and Golang going pretty quickly and I felt safe putting it up there that I hadn't accidentally screwed something up that I didn't understand how it went. So it sounds like you use ChatGPT in kind of a similar manner.
Yeah, it is remarkable. It is remarkable how much power you get when you get to stop being afraid of coming across as stupid. And it's ridiculous if you look at my ChatGPT like transcripts. Like, I still apologize. I'm like, I'm really sorry, this is a stupid question. I know this makes me sound like an idiot. And he doesn't care, but I keep saying it. And ChatGPT is like, it's like humorously encouraging some of the time. It's keep plugging away at it, buddy. I'm right there with you every step.
It does that to me too. It actually tried to console me once because I was having a hard time because Firebase functions don't work with Multer. And so we had to use Busboy to like do this like file upload thing. And I've never even touched Busboy because I always use Multer, because why would I touch the lower level stuff? And it's just, yeah, you really persevered, man. You did a really good job. And I was just like, how did you know to console me? There's always this little like, how did you know how to do that?
But yeah, there is, when we use it, we face questions about how much to try to get it to do our work for us, have it function as like a low code or a no code programming tool, versus how much you use it as like a pair coder or a mentor or a teacher. One of the most powerful things to do with ChatGPT is to say, can you give me a crash course on this? Or I have this section of code. Could you explain to me like what the concept is that's going on here that I don't quite get? And when you try to actually learn from it, it can be just extremely powerful. There is, of course, the temptation to try to say, you know what? I can get ChatGPT to explain this to me anytime I need to. So I've as good as learned it already. Right?
There is that temptation.
Yeah. And because, of course, there's a little bit of a reality to that. Like that, I think some people don't realize, but a lot of us are already very used to treating Google that way. We know so much is accessible on Stack Overflow or so forth that like we offload learning certain kinds of concepts because we can really grab those quite easily. Or like we offload learning core language features because we know we can check the reference when we need to.
Exactly.
Right? There's a certain amount of controversy over that with coding interview questions, with a lot of people saying it's really arbitrary and stupid to not let people just access language reference while they're doing them, because at your actual job you do. I certainly am Googling like MDN, JavaScript, blank array method or whatever a lot of the time, because there's unquestionably an increase in power that comes from just having outsourced some of the things we think about. But there's always a loss involved in that transaction. And
Right.
whether it's worth it is something to think about. And that question is as old as Socrates. Like in the Phaedo, one of the dialogues Plato wrote about Socrates, he has Socrates and this dude, or not Phaedo, Phaedrus is what I meant, my apologies, like sitting outside of the city. And Phaedrus says, Socrates, there was this great argument that I heard in the city, and it impressed me so much, you're going to want to hear it too. And Socrates says, great, break it out. Tell me it. And Phaedrus says, okay, happy to. I've got the scroll right here. And Socrates says, wait, what? You've got the scroll? And Phaedrus says, oh yeah, I liked the argument so much I had him write it down. And Socrates is like, how on earth are you trying to tell me that you were impressed by an argument, but you do not know it? You can't tell it to me. You're going to say instead you have it like in your pocket. That's not knowing. Scrolls scrolls provide the illusion of knowing, and they're very dangerous. And so he was arguing that you should never let a scroll give you the idea that you have understood or internalized something. And so I think that dynamic is still present in a whole lot of the tooling we use right now. It's very easy to get the illusion that we've really internalized something because we have that tool somehow like in our possession or something like that.
The tool doing it, not you necessarily.
Right. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to go back to not using GPS to drive around places, but it does mean we've changed as individuals in certain ways. And especially when, I guess in coding, let me try to wrap this up and make it relevant. It does change the way that you can think about things as like a problem solver. If you're having to check like the reference and the documentation versus really having it in your head. And I still think there's a lot of value to trying to really enhance that core of what you've really mastered.
I actually want to ask this question because I think you're more versed in the classics than I am, and I find it immensely interesting you pulled out Socrates here. Do you feel your classics training has brought up questions or like viewpoints that you've used in your coding career, or like you use in looking at like tech and seeing it from that angle?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm a little bit ambivalent about it because there have been moments in my career, like a couple of years ago, there were four of us at my company that got tapped to do all the interviews for the interns that were coming in during the summer. And it was like, it was three people and me that I loved. They were some of my favorite people in the company. And one time when we were chatting, like waiting for the person to show up, we were getting to know each other a little better. And we realized that none of us had computer science backgrounds. One guy was a philosophy major. One woman was like a violin player and a music major. Another guy had been a music major. And then I had done liberal arts. And it really struck me that I didn't think it was a coincidence that we were four people who they viewed as very reliably like great with people and good at engaging and good at communicating in that way. That said, I don't know how strongly to hold to it because I've certainly met many very technical and computer science background people who are also awesome at that. And I'm a little wary of trying to say that I got any superpowers from my liberal arts background. I do think it certainly shapes the way I think about things and shapes and gives me a different approach that is more about ideas sometimes than other people. It also means that I really don't know sometimes core computer science concepts that other people view as incredibly elementary. I don't know. For me, I guess the big thing is it makes me who I am. It makes me different. It gives me something that I'm excited to share with the people I work with. And I don't know, that's always been what I'm most confident saying about that.
So I will tell you a little story. It actually pertains to you when I first switched over from being a teacher to being a coder. This was way back when. I don't know if you'll remember this. It's probably when I first met you actually was that was when I got home from China. I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do for my next career. I knew it wasn't going to be teaching. I wanted to get out of the teaching profession, and I met someone, and essentially, like, I had, again, when you're first starting off, you have no idea. You get advice from people, and you have absolutely no idea to tell whether or not it's good or not. So essentially, the first guy I talked to told me I would have to go back to college and get another 4 year degree in computer
Mhm.
science if I was ever going to have any chance of becoming a coder, programmer, software engineer. And I remember telling you that, and your first response was, "That's complete BS." And you didn't even hesitate. And I was just like, okay,
Yeah.
awesome. So I guess then my liberal arts major is fine as long as I'm willing to learn. What you say is a fair, obviously for me, like I said, I did Asian studies. It's official, folks. I did Asian studies. And then you're also come from a non technical background. It doesn't give us superpowers, but it definitely is not a hindrance, right?
I would say yes, but it's like in different ways. It does make you better at certain things and give you certain differences in perspective. And to be honest, I think there's some wisdom in the idea of balancing a workplace with like self-taught people versus people with more technical backgrounds,
Sure.
because we contribute different things. But yeah, looking at your career and your trajectory is just, I think it makes me look awesome in terms of believing that, because there's so much that people who come from different backgrounds can bring to the job that then gives them like these angles of creativity and interest that are different. And especially, I think like core tech skills and development skills, like in a lot of ways they're just getting easier to acquire. And as that becomes more and more the case, it's those abstract skills that are demonstrated by being really interested in deep human concerns like history, like liberal arts, things like that. Those just become more valuable.
I think that they're very applicable in a lot of different places. For example, I find myself sometimes doing a little bit of design at work. They were surprised I could recreate the logo just because I've done graphics work before. And they were like, "Oh, okay, cool. We thought you were just a back-end engineer that just did like algorithms. Like you can actually do colors too."
Hmm.
One thing I do want to ask is because you've done so much front end work, which is not the area that I normally traffic in. So, what is generally like, how would you describe front end work to someone who didn't know what it was? Okay, because sometimes I tell my bootcamp students that they may want to pick, they may be full stack generalists, but they may find that they enjoy design, or they may find that they enjoy the mathematical aspect. What, if, in very briefly, what would you describe what a front end engineer does?
Oh, it's a little hard to say, and I'm tempted to give you more of a poetical answer than the most accurate answer. And so the
Nice.
poetical answer I'll give you is, if you ever had an experience where you gave like a button on a web page, like a rollover state or a rollover animation with hover, or certainly like with JavaScript back in the day of giving an on mouse over attribute. And when you did it and you moved that mouse over the button and it changed color, you were like, yeah. And then you did it like 50 more times and you were like, this is awesome. Then you're a front end engineer, or then you might be a front end engineer, because I think there is an elemental pleasure in interfaces that just lights some people up. And it just lights me up. It is so much fun to make these like machines, these devices, these things that we can interact with. That I think is similar to what a person who's good at woodworking gets. Similar, that's just something can go from my brain out into my hands, or a mouse and computer screen, and then I get to interact with it. It can become part of me. And how you round out just how much you still do backend stuff or work with APIs or work with all sorts of other stuff, that's a little bit of a side question. I think if that interface work feels like a necessary evil or tedious, you might be a full stack person or a backend developer who can do interface work. It's always going to be secondary. But if that part of it just lights you up, yeah, then you might be a front end person.
That is amazing because I know the feeling you're talking about. I don't get the same feeling you do from mousing over stuff. I got the feeling from benchmarking an algorithm and seeing it like be done in fractions of a millisecond, but it's the same feeling. So
Yeah.
I think I know what you're getting at. So that might be the true test of whether to see like where your passion in programming lies. So one last question, and again, so the coding your career is all about people who are either not in coding but want to get into it or just started. It sounds like again we're both on the self-taught route. What advice would you give to someone who's either thinking about getting into it or maybe like just starting? Maybe they're in a boot camp, maybe they're just out of it. What can they do to really? What do you think is the most effective thing they can do to like get themselves into tech and be effective?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess I would double down on what we were talking about earlier with evergreen skills. I think the more you can focus on core skills, the better off you'll be. For one thing, because they'll be long lived, like we mentioned, and it also can help reduce the surface area of how much you're trying to learn at once. Because there's
Hmm.
so much you could learn, and it can be really overwhelming. It can be daunting. It can feel defeating, and especially like if you're looking at job postings and things like that, and looking at all the skills they want and say, oh God, how am I ever going to learn all these things? It's useful to know that some of those things are more important than others. And some of the core things, like just vanilla JavaScript, for instance, or Linux skills, are going to be relevant forever. And so if you put some time into that, that will help a lot. Yeah, and I guess, and then the other thing I would just say is I think like mentor mentee relationships can be tremendously powerful, especially at the beginning. And I'm not sure that I want to lean too much into the kind of formalized, so I need to find a mentor thing and be able to have someone with that title. But I just mean having somebody that's there to really answer your questions, and help explain them to you can be so much more powerful than just dealing with just being like you and the internet, where a lot of times you can face a lot of feelings about feeling stupid or bad about yourself because you're not getting the thing that some webpage that's not quite aimed at someone your level is trying to impart. And it's interesting because ChatGPT is part of that now. You have someone that you can truly ask fearless things about, and I think learning to have that as a tutor is a huge step. But then I still would recommend trying to connect with someone that can just be a fellow human with you, and someone that can help provide some of the benefits of like friendship and human, like we're all on the same path together things, because that is going to be, first of all, there's just a genuine joy in being able to teach and being able to be taught. And maybe let me make that a quick footnote. Don't feel embarrassed about being the student, being the person receiving. Like there's a pleasure and a joy for the person that gets to teach you. And so you're not like coming like a supplicant with nothing to offer. Like that's a true partnership. Yeah, so I guess that's really what I would say. Narrow down what you're trying to learn, some of the core stuff, the best, and then try to work with someone who can teach you.
The last part was absolutely beautiful because I had a guy, essentially I lived with him for a month. Like I 6 days a week, just he was teaching me how to code. He was extremely generous with his time. Senior engineer, to this day, I still mentally think of him as the god of coding. You know what I'm saying? In my
Yeah.
brain, I just he
Yeah.
just knows everything. I still ask him about coding questions, even as a senior. That's but that connection, like initially I had that feeling of, oh, I'm just taking from him, right? I don't know anything. I'm just taking from him. But then I realized he actually enjoyed teaching me. He actually enjoyed going through the joy of design patterns and understanding clean code and like all these basic wonderful things that make a good programmer, rediscovering the joy of those things. He could rediscover them with me because it was new to me.
Hmm. Absolutely. Montessori classrooms are structured explicitly to allow for this because they have multi age groups all together. For 3 years, you'll be with the same cohort. And you'll go from being the youngest, knowing the least, to being the oldest and knowing the most. And the idea is that you get to really experience the different sides of first really being the learner, being the receiver, and then being the person able to know a lot and give that. And there's so much reward to be had in all different sides of that relationship.
I think it's absolutely beautiful. Thank you, Nate, so much. This has been a really enlightening conversation. I, of course, always cheer the back end, but I think that you and I both have a very similar arc. And again, we're both not comp sci majors. So, again, if anyone is having any trepidation about thinking that they can't get into tech unless they have that comp sci degree, you have two examples right in front of you where that we both are thriving in the industry, and that's not the case. So, thank you very much
Absolutely.
for having this conversation today. It's been really awesome.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure. Thank you, Jonathan.